Hi, my name is Alana. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This is a YouTube channel in which mainly we focus on one book reviews. Just sit down and have a nice long chat about one book in particular, the occasional book haul, the occasional tag, but mainly long format book reviews. Now, today's video is long overdue. It is the second installment of my Under the Radar series. Earlier in the year, like winter time, at the beginning of the year, I did the first installment and I covered 6 books that I felt should get more recognition. They're under the radar. They tend to either they've been in publication for so long that they don't have the hype around them anymore, or they just never had a whole lot of hype around them in the first place, but they've always been in publication, and I just think that more people should know about them because they're hidden gems. We get bumped, and the reason why I started this series initially on my Instagram is because we're constantly, as readers, being bombarded by new releases. And don't get me wrong, new releases are fun, they're exciting, but there are plenty of good books already out there that I think should constantly be in the forefront. Yes. So this is my second installment. Now, in the first video, again, I covered 6 books. Moving forward, so from this video onward, I'm going to do 3 books at a time, which is what I do on Instagram, and I think that's a little bit easier for me to manage. So this is going to be 3 books. In this particular video, I am going to be talking about 3 classics by 3 well-known classic authors that don't get as much attention as their other main works, even though they're known, but people tend to focus on the books that make them the first thing that you think of when you think of this author. None of these books typically come up. So, and you'll see why when I talk about these authors. So the first one is going to be Villette by Charlotte Bronte. Again, this is a title that if you are into classic literature, especially if you're into Victorian literature, you probably have come across this title. But of course, it's Jane Eyre. Sorry, of course, it's Charlotte Bronte. So when people think of Charlotte Bronte, they think Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is my favorite book of all time. I know I say it all the time. I love that book. It's my favorite classic. It's a book that got me into classics. It wasn't the first classic I read, but it was the first classic I really connected with. And because of that book, Charlotte Bronte became my favorite author. And believe it or not, for years, I didn't know that she had other novels. Clearly, I was living under a rock. My reading was very different also when I discovered Jane Eyre. But Villette is really Charlotte Bronte's masterpiece that gets overshadowed by Jane Eyre. Though Jane Eyre is still my favorite, this is the better novel. As much as I love Jane Eyre, as much as I think Jane Eyre is worth the hype, I'm rereading Jane Eyre for the 4th time this October. As I said, Villette is the masterpiece. It is exquisite. It's dark, it's moody, it's witty, it's more mature. You can really see between Jane Eyre and this book, and this is her last published novel, how much Charlotte had improved as a writer. And Jane Eyre is good. Like the writing in that book, chef's kiss. But when you get to Villette, it's a whole different ballgame. Charlotte is in her prime in this book. And it's a shame that the Bronte sisters had such short lives because I feel like we're just missing out on so much gothic, moody literature. But again, it is what it is. We're grateful for what we do have. You can also tell that in Villette, Charlotte was not really in a good mental headspace when she wrote this book. This is a darker, more depressing book than Jane Eyre. And I know people who have to be in the right headspace as a reader to read this book. By the time she wrote this book at a time when she had lost all of her siblings, they'd all passed away. And Villette is really even more autobiographical than Jane Eyre for Charlotte Bronte. It tells the tale of Lucy, who was a governess, who is left in the world with no biological family members left that she knows of. She has no friends, and she is pining for a man that doesn't really reciprocate her affections. And this man is kind to her, but he's just not into her. Isn't that a book? He's just not into you. He's just not into her. Poor Lucy. This is not a happy novel in any way. And you can see, and I would argue that when you're reading this book, you can see in my thoughts, I think that Charlotte was using this as a bit of therapy. This book was her therapy, my girl. And the whole book time I was reading this book, I was like, Charlotte, you need help. But this was the 1800s, you know what I'm saying? So you could tell that Charlotte was grieving. She does, however, sprinkle in some really funny moments and some funny lines. There's a lot of dry, witty humor, and that give you just the break that you need at the right time. Though again, this is not a funny novel at all. There are also some very beautifully written passages when Lucy, the main character, is also at her lowest. And yet, as you can expect with a Charlotte Bronte novel, because, she was the daughter of a vicar. Is he a vicar? A pastor, what we call that now? She grew up in faith, in the Christian faith. She still clings to that. She refuses to give up regardless of how dark her life gets. And it's really kind of a beautiful thing to witness because you see that that's also Charlotte. And it's also very sad to read. Like, there was one point when the main character, Lucy, is clinging to her faith when she's at this point, she's at her rock bottom. And I am not an emotional reader, you guys. I do not cry a lot in my real life. I cannot remember the last time I cried as of this video. I don't even, it's been at least maybe since 2021. I don't know. But my throat got a little tight. Again, I read this book back in 2000 and was it 2020? I think I read this book in 2020. I got to that passage and I was like, somebody chopping onions, my throat's getting tight. It was just very raw. So yes, this is, I'll say it again for the people in the back, a stunning piece of literature. It is stunning, depressing, but stunning. And it's the type of book that I think that especially Bronte fans of dark, cold classics that are moody, and by cold, I mean literally cold. The character's always cold. It's France and it's snowing and it's just the temperature of this book is cold. And I read this in December, again in 2020, perfect time of the year to read this book. We get imagery of the cold sea and the winter months. This is the type of thing that bookish, cozy, literary nerds will fiend over. Okay? This is a gold mine of coziness, even though it's depressing. I know. Lots of dichotomies here. You're going to get giddy over the descriptive passages and the writing. Again, it is Charlotte in her prime. She's a master at constructing the atmosphere. Good stuff. And I just think that this is a book, a classic, especially for the Bronte, fans of the Brontes. Don't let this book fly past your radar. It's just one of those classics I think more people should read. It gets overshadowed, I think, by other Victorian classics. I'm raving. Let's move on. We have Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskill. And when we think Mary Barton, we think North and South and Wives and Daughters. I've read North and South. I have not read yet Wives and Daughters. Mary Barton is actually the first novel that Gaskill wrote. She wrote it after she lost her son. In this book, this is a video about therapy. This book was her therapy, okay? Facts. And it was her way to cope with the loss of her son. This novel mainly centers around the beautiful Mary Barton, as we can tell by the title, who is a poor working girl. She's very attractive, okay, as one is. And she is thus the center of attention of a wealthy manufacturer's son. It sounds a bit like North and South, doesn't it? She has a childhood friend, Jim. Jim is a guy who was head over heels for my girl Mary. But Mary, I ain't saying she a gold digger, but she looking at that manufacturer's son, okay? Jim is sprung. My boy Jim is so in love with Mary. It's almost a sickness. What's going on here? Yeah, he's sprung. But Mary is, because she's young, and we forgive her for being young because we were all young and immature at some time, right? I know adults who are very immature. Her immaturity actually blinds her for who is the better man, which obviously it's Jim. Oh, come on. We know that. Elizabeth Gaskill makes this clear that Jim is the better man. However, this book doesn't just center around this love triangle. In true Gaskill style, she is using this to drive home the social conditions of this time, especially the conditions of the poor and the tensions between workers and their masters. Again, if you are a fan of North and South, you're going to be a fan of this book. If you are a fan of Dickens, this is a topic that Dickens often describes. Dickens loved this novel. He sang this novel's praises. It's very Dickensian in the fact that it is dirty. Literally, it's grimy, it's cold, it's in a manufacturer's town. You get a very clear picture of the discrepancies between the rich and the poor, the manufacturer and the worker. And you can also see in this book, if you're a fan of North and South, you can see how Gaskill took a lot of the elements in this book and then expanded on them in North and South. I actually think that if you are new to Elizabeth Gaskill and you want to read North and South, I would actually recommend reading Mary Barton first and then going to North and South, because I think that a lot of the conversations that we have with, say, some of the characters in North and South about working conditions and the relationship between the worker and the employer, she lays a lot of that framework here. If you're a fan, in debates between capitalism and socialism, this is for you. Because this is a conversation that is actually happening, especially in Europe and Britain at this time. And she presents subtle cases for both, but she's really leaning towards, in this particular book, and this is something that you see in Mary Barton in North and South, something that we have, there's a term for it today. We would call it conscious capitalism, because she's saying that this system between the laborer and the worker can work, but you have to have, the labor and the employer can work, but you have to have an employer who does have compassion in order for the lives of those who are being worked, who are the workers, the laborers, to have a better quality of life and get good wages or whatever. You don't have to go all the way to, socialism. Fun fact, this book was published in 1848, the same year that the Communist Manifesto was published. And if you've watched any of my older videos, you know I cannot stand Karl Marx, okay? He was not a nice man. He's nobody I would want to model my society after. If you ever really dig into his stuff, you don't even have to dig that far. Read some of his stuff. My man was dark. He's just not a hero for me. Just saying. And I did have to study him in university. What a scumbag. Don't like him. So yeah, Elizabeth Gaskill's Mary Barton. Highly recommend. It's not a super long classic. I think it's also a good classic for people who may be intimidated for classics. The plot is easy to follow, gorgeous writing, but it's not super dense. I think North and South can be a bit dense in places it doesn't need to be dense. And this is a nice balance, I think, between the two, where you're philosophizing and you're talking about societal structures without getting too much in the weeds. There are times in North and South where some of those conversations that went on for pages about the relationship between the worker and the employer, I was like, please shut up. Don't get me wrong, I like North and South. It's a great novel, but it's a little bit wordy in some places. The Victorians, they talk too much. My boy Jim, getting the short end of the stick with the love. Mary, Jim's the guy. Hop to it. Next book. Last book, flashing it. Sanditon by Jane Austen. Of course, when we think of Jane Austen, we think Pride and Prejudice first and foremost, and her other 5 novels, Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, Persuasion, Northanger Abbey, Emma, all of which I have read except Mansfield Park. Is Jane Austen not a subtle comedian? She is. She's hysterical. Now, Sanditon, of course, now that it has a show, did the show ever come back? I don't know. I've seen it first. Not my cup of tea. I wasn't feeling it. But, so yes, this is a classic, a piece of a classic. It was never finished. Unfortunately, Jane Austen passed away before she could finish it. It's known. It's well known. But it's not the first thing that you think of when it comes to Jane Austen. And this particular edition, typically when you purchase Sanditon, it will also come with 2 short stories. So if you've read all of her completed works and you still want to read some Jane Austen, you're craving something a little new, I highly recommend Sanditon. Sanditon, yes, it's very well known amongst Austen fans, but it does, I feel like, get caught in the weeds, buried a little bit, if you will, as it's just not as widely read as her other novels. I don't know if it's because that is unfinished. Some people don't want to bother with an unfinished work, but I do think that it's worth the time. And again, it has 2 novellas in this particular one, Lady Susan, which was hysterical, by the way, and The Watsons. I particularly found Lady Susan to be a real treat because Lady Susan, this is a word that's often overused, but bear with me. She's a true narcissist, okay? And I don't use that lightly. And The Watsons was okay. Actually, at the top of my brain, I can't remember what The Watsons are about. I didn't find The Watsons to be memorable. And in Sanditon, we do have a main character who she's spending some time with some true characters on the seaside. And of course, there's going to be a potential romance. We've got hypochondriacs. It is just classic Jane Austen. And I will say that when I was reading Sanditon, it didn't, even the first chapters, few pages that we do have, it didn't grab me as much as, say, some of her other novels that I've read, but it's always a treat to read Jane Austen. So if, classic that I think should be, don't pass over because it's an unfinished work. It's got all of Jane Austen's brilliance and wit and a little bit of romance. What more can you want? I didn't spend as much time on Sanditon, just that gets a shout out. But have you read any of these pieces of fiction? Are they on your radar? Were they never on your radar? There are so many other classics out there that need to get more attention. There are so many classics out there that I still think deserve more attention. And as I continue to read through the classics, I will hopefully put more up there. But yes, that is my second installment of Under the Radar books. Have you read Villette, Mary Barton, and Sanditon? I definitely went on more and more about Villette and Mary Barton. My bad, but it is what it is. If you haven't read them, has this video piqued your interest? I hope so. I am going to wrap up. Please leave me a comment below. Also, feel free to like and subscribe. Follow me on the Instagram where I get up to more book of shenanigans, because the internet is for funny memes and not fighting over stupid stuff, which I often see people doing. I'm going to sign off. Bye.